Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. We're so glad that you're here today. In this episode, I'm really going to dive into the topic of intimacy. And when I say intimacy, I'm talking about more than just sex, although sex is going to be an outcome and part of real intimacy. If you want to sort of hear some of the episodes that we've specifically done on re-engaging in the sexual relationship, you can go back to episodes 54, 55, and 56. But today, I just want to talk about some of the difficulties around reestablishing, or let me even say this, creating for the first time intimacy and why that can be difficult. And the reason I say creating for the first time is because what I've discovered through coaching and through kind of walking through this experience with my betrayed partners. And I notice that for some, if not many, after betrayal and addiction, the intimacy that I'm talking about is maybe being established for the very first time. And there's many reasons for this. We know that sex addiction is actually an intimacy disorder, right? So one of the partners may actually have to learn what true intimacy really means. And when I'm talking about intimacy, I'm talking about much more than sex. I'm talking about, the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical connection that you can have with a partner. And I think for many of us, this idea can be strange, particularly after betrayal as the betrayed partner. It can feel very confusing. There may be phases where we feel like this concept is absolutely impossible to achieve. And I find myself having these conversations with betrayed partners a lot about vulnerability, about intimacy, about reestablishing sexual connection and safety and all of these different things. So I thought it would be a good topic to sort of discuss some of the reasons that this particular issue can be so difficult, but also some of the benefits that can come from this as well. Like what are the benefits of real intimacy? So I don't think that you can have a true intimacy without feeling safe to be completely vulnerable with your partner. So I kind of want to just communicate that really clearly up front too, because it's such a bizarre, if you think about it, it's such a weird thing that we as humans can physically have sex with another person, but then be really afraid to have a vulnerable conversation or to sit across from our partner and gaze into their eyes and do eye gazing or hold hands and just stare into each other's eyes because that feels uncomfortable. So what I am talking about is intimacy. It includes all of those things. Yes, sex is included, but sometimes for whatever reason, we can compartmentalize that as just a physical act, and we can actually remove the intimacy out of it. And one of the things that I really want to push sort of in this conversation is that sex should really be an outcome of the other types of intimacy where you're feeling very connected and safe with your partner, and so that it is not just a physical act. But there are so many reasons that real intimacy is incredibly scary. For the betrayed partner, the sexual piece and the confidence in our bodies and the physicality is one of the biggest pain points of the trauma we have experienced. So for many betrayed partners, the idea of real vulnerability and taking down those walls of protection after betrayal and relaxing and feeling safe and experiencing connection with our partner in a way that is like, here is my vulnerability, here's my fear, here are all my insecurities. That can be really, really scary because when you look at the wounding for a betrayed partner, her sexuality and her self-worth, those are at like the deepest points of the wound. And so recovery in that area, or I'm going to say even in creation. So what I've noticed is a lot of couples have difficulty because this may not be something, this true intimacy and connection may not be something that they've ever experienced in the past. So it's not even a recreation. It is an actual first creation. Let's establish something brand new. And there's so many reasons that this can feel frustrating, right? It's like we've done all this recovery work, we've created safety. My husband's not recovering anymore. Shouldn't sex just be good? Shouldn't intimacy just be there? Shouldn't we just get the reward for doing all this hard work? Yes, I totally get it. Absolutely. It is so frustrating. And I want to offer up this idea that it's so much more than what we have been taught as human beings. We have this concept of sexuality, I think, as a culture and intimacy as a culture that's just super skewed. I think, like I mentioned, it can be compartmentalized into just this physical thing. And it should ultimately, at its real created intention, be a emotional spiritual connection with your partner. It should be this really deep, vulnerable thing. And I just don't think we talk about it enough. So, in today's episode, I'm going to talk about 5 reasons sex and intimacy can be difficult. We're also going to talk about 5 benefits of true intimacy. And then next week, we're going to go into some questions to actually go through with your partner to help deepen intimacy and vulnerability. So, again, I always like to put this caveat when I'm talking about these types of topics. This is assuming that some of the foundational work has been done. So, if you guys are brand new in your journey, please go back to the beginning of season 1. A lot of our episodes sort of build on each other as you move through the recovery process and build safety and security. If you are in like week 2, month 2, this may not be the episode for you just because this requires, what I'm talking about sort of requires the foundation of safety and stability, which is going to mean that, your partner has been in recovery, you are communicating really well, you're not worried about a relapse, you've dealt with some of the initial shock and trauma of discovery, that sort of thing. We're talking about further down the road when you are really trying to create your long-term relationship. What does that look like? And, for betrayed partners, of course, we're going to want this to be better than ever, right? We're really going to need this to feel exciting and hopeful and safe, among other things. So let's just start with 5 reasons sex and intimacy can be difficult, specifically after betrayal and an addiction. So number 1, and I was sort of touching on this concept with the introduction here, maybe you've never experienced what true intimacy feels like, or you haven't seen it lived out as a model. So when I think about this, I think about culturally, I think about, faith backgrounds, I think about all these ways that real intimacy is not really demonstrated clearly in much of society. It's certainly not demonstrated in our media. It's certainly not demonstrated in pornography. That's the opposite of what true intimacy is. It's not demonstrated, unfortunately, a lot in church. I think about what God designed intimacy and sexuality to be versus how we sort of communicate it in the faith culture. And it's gotten so far off the path. And what that does is it keeps people very stuck. How are we supposed to know how to navigate this if we've never seen it happen, right? And many of you may relate to families of origin where things just weren't talked about, right? You have an experience, maybe you talk about it one time and then you never talk about it again. Or something really hard happens and it's just swept under the rug. Or you see your parents arguing, but you never see them reconcile, right? And so we don't always have these great examples of what intimacy and connection really look like. So I'm just going to put out there that I think what really creates true intimacy with a couple is the ability to be deeply vulnerable, the ability to feel safe, which of course is going to allow the vulnerability to happen, communicating your thoughts and your fears and your insecurities with each other. And again, feeling safe to do that because that is a vulnerable thing to do. And feeling connected. So energetically, right? You have a friendship, you have an energetic connection, you care about your partner, you care what they're thinking, what they're feeling, right? It's a two-way street. If we have one person that wants to do all these things and is pouring into the other, and the other person has a 3-foot wall of defenses up, it's going to block all of that energy. So that's not going to be real intimacy. You may have a variation of a friendship, but that's not going to be true intimacy. True intimacy has to be bidirectional. You have to have two people who have open heart centers, who are willingly sharing energy with the other person. They're pouring into the other person. They are both willing to be open and vulnerable. They are both providing safety for the other person. And now, even just going through that right there, you can see how this is not going to happen month 2 after betrayal, because the betrayed partner is going to have a 3-foot wall up, defending herself because she's been wounded by this person. And so what I want to do is sort of establish the idea of what intimacy can be, because I'm not sure we really have good examples of it. But I also want to make sure that that if this is not something you've really thought about, I get it. When I started going through betrayal, there was actually a book that I read that really, and I think I listened to a podcast and there was a book that I was reading, and both of them gave me this concept of sex being a spiritually connecting act, and how, almost transcendent it can be. And it was really such an interesting concept to me. And I was like, that's really what I want. I want that connection with my partner. And there's so many other areas in life where sex is not talked about like that. Connection with your partner is not talked about that. And I see this lived out in culture, how people will, in their relationships, find a way to interact with each other where they can survive, where they can manage well with each other. Maybe they live on a level of friendship that is, I know how to sort of anticipate what's going to happen. I can feel a sense of control, but maybe that's missing the next level where there's joy, where there's relaxation. Maybe then if they're on that level, they're missing the next level where there's deep, deep vulnerability and safety. So it's just, I think there's more. There's so much more we can get out of a relationship. And when we're going through betrayal and recovery, I think it is very, very much worth holding that as the standard so that we can consistently move forward with that as the goal. We want to move forward. But it's going to be one of the reasons that it can be difficult is because we may not have seen what that truly looks like. So hopefully, as we continue talking today and throughout the podcast, we can create that vision for you and kind of spark that hope that is possible, and that there is more to relationships when it comes to connection, safety, vulnerability, and even sexuality. The second reason sex and intimacy can be difficult is the betrayed partner keeps up defenses due to the pain of the betrayal trauma. So like I mentioned, this is going to depend on the phase that you're in. It's not going to be appropriate, month 2, but at some point during the recovery process, let's say the addict has done all of the work, they are checking off every single box, they are solidly in recovery. You as the betrayed partner tap into your intuition and know that it is truly a heart change. It's not just that they're doing it so that they don't get in trouble. They really, really want to live in recovery. And you notice these communication changes in them, these behavior changes in them, these heart changes in them. And you get to a point in recovery where, okay, I'm so used to having my wall up. Now that's just my pattern, but it's not healthy anymore. I don't actually need to have this up. And in fact, you hit a point where keeping your defenses up and keeping that wall and keeping that sense of protection only creates a barrier between you and your partner reconnecting or connecting for the first time. And the scary part of healing, and it doesn't matter what version of healing you are, and moving forward is always uncomfortable. So as the betrayed partner, one of the most difficult things that we will find as we navigate the continued process of recovery is that we will eventually hit a wall where if we want to continue moving forward, it's going to be uncomfortable. And I think, again, because I said at the beginning, because sexuality and intimacy is one of the deepest parts of the wound created by betrayal, this can be one of the most difficult to begin releasing control of, to begin taking down brick by brick that wall of protection, right? And so how does this show up? A lot of times we might have every right to feel angry, bitter, and resentful and have sort of these emotions that make us feel cold, these emotions that make us feel empowered, these emotions that make us feel like we are the partner we are the person in the relationship that has control, that has power, whatever that is, whatever pattern that is, whatever pattern of communication, whatever emotions allow you to feel that way. And we can really, really, really hold on to those, because the alternative of growth and healing, which that wall is really hiding, is sadness, grief, really the deeper emotions that anger and bitterness and that sense of empowerment can really be hiding. And so the fear, of course, a natural tendency for the betrayed partner is, I want to feel empowered after I felt very disempowered by my partner, right? That's going to be a natural tendency. At some point along the road, though, when they are in recovery and doing the right thing, and you are intentionally, consciously choosing reconciliation and want to move forward, that is when we have to recognize the wall that we are keeping up, the defense that we are keeping up, and intentionally, consciously choose to begin taking it down and practice brick by brick, so that we know that it is safe. And that we begin to have the experience of, okay, I'm going to be more vulnerable and allow you to hold that space for me. And then I'm going to recognize that I am safe, and then I can do it again. 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 Now, an example of this is when we were talking about reestablishing sex and intimacy in episodes 54 and 55, and we were walking through our process. It was very, very, very much baby steps, right? And so that's just one example of how that can be done. But this can also be done in conversation. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more next week, when I give you some specific questions to ask with your partner to dig into vulnerability and more intimacy there and connection. But just keep that in mind. One thing that is going to be helpful is to notice where you are stuck and where that wall is coming up, and how does that show up in your relationship, because it's going to be difficult to move forward. Well, it's going to be impossible to move forward if the wall stays there forever. The third reason that sex and intimacy might be difficult after betrayal is because a majority of sexual experiences for the addicted partner have been associated with bad. And so a majority of the experiences that he has had are also associated with a lot of guilt and shame. So he might feel like sex in general, even if he consciously knows that this is something that God created and that it's something beautiful to experience with his partner, your partner may have a majority of his experiences with pornography or masturbation or affairs or whatever it is. And if that's a majority of his sexual experience, he may have a really difficult time thinking of himself as a sexual being okay, that is okay. He may also have a really difficult time thinking of sex as being good, even though he may logically think, I know that it was created for good. In his experience, it has been used for evil, right? And it has created all of these cycles of shame and guilt. So you have to remember that, again, sex addiction is an intimacy disorder. It's a real contradiction for the people outside of the addiction, because we go, well, you're acting out so much in a sexual way. How do you not really know how to connect sexually in the real world? Or how do you not know how to be an intimate partner in the real world? But it's because pornography and sexual addiction is so anti-intimacy that creating intimacy with their partner, who they view as good, you are in a different category. So think about that disconnect as well. They have sex and pornography and masturbation and their sexuality in a box that is guilt and shame and negativity and bad. And they put you in a category of good and clean and innocent. And they may have, in some situations, difficulty. How do I transition that? How do I bring sexuality into the box of good without carrying guilt and shame, right? And so that's a process for their recovery. That may be a big wall, a big barrier on their side that they need to identify as they continue to process the shame, as they learn how to reconnect with themselves as a sexual being in a healthy way. What is healthy sexuality? What does it mean? How can I connect to my partner in a safe, vulnerable, intimate way? And intimacy for them is going to be difficult, because with the history of addiction, one of the primary methods there is that, hey, I have uncomfortable big emotions. I can self-medicate them, which means I don't actually ever have to sit through and feel them completely deeply and learn how to process them and communicate them. So this is even just communicating their feelings, even just identifying their feelings is, can be for many very difficult and part of the recovery process. So that's one of the reasons that it can be difficult from their side. And recovery is going to then have to do with identifying the emotions, learning how to feel them in a safe way, and communicating them, right? If we think about intimacy between a couple, there's this bi-directional communication happening where essentially, more or less, you always sort of know what's going on in your partner's world. How are they feeling? What are they thinking? How are they interpreting things that are happening, right? And if one partner doesn't even know how to identify that in their own life, they're going to have difficulty connecting and sharing that with you. So part of their recovery process is learning that. And then the next step in that is going to be communicating it, right? And so that is a part of vulnerability, because for many of them, many addicted partners that are in recovery, or even before they get into recovery, part of the thing that keeps them in their addiction is this intense fear that if anyone actually knows them or sees who they really are, they're going to be rejected. They're not really lovable. They're not good enough. If you knew who they were, you would leave, right? That's one of the biggest fears that they have. So through recovery, for them, it's going to be a process too of taking down brick by brick, of telling you and showing you these parts of themselves and then being loved and accepted. Now, this doesn't mean, hey, I'm going to tell you about this thing that I did where I cheated on you and then you're going to love me and accept me. And, that's not what I'm talking about. We have the healing process of disclosure and the polygraph and learning about the behaviors and moving through that process. I'm talking more about once we've passed that and you're learning and you've really learned how to communicate your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions with each other. Now you're learning more about the deeper levels. What are the wounds that they were medicating? What are the beliefs that they had about themselves, the fears, the insecurities? What are the, what is the belief? Like if, I'm really unlovable and no matter what I do, I'll never be accepted, right? Is that a belief that they held? And so those are the types of conversations that create intimacy in a relationship where you really end up real understanding how it is that your partner thinks. How do they see the world? How do they feel? How do they view their addiction? How do they view recovery? How do they view you? Right? So that can be difficult because for them, they've never experienced that before. And maybe you haven't either. And that's why I mentioned earlier, sometimes this is a brand new experience for both people to create this type of intimacy, this type of vulnerability. But particularly an addict, having self-medicated for so long, this is going to be a learning process. And having associated sexuality with things that are bad for so long is also going to be a relearning process. So learning how to accept their own body, learning how to bring healthy sexuality into the compartment that they have you, that is good and beautiful and pure and innocent, and how to mix and mingle those two things in a healthy way. That can be a real learning process for them and for both of you. The fourth reason that sex and intimacy can be difficult for partners after betrayal, this is a similar idea, but more on the betrayed partner side. Being raised in a faith-based purity culture, there are confusing messages about your value being tied to your sexuality or lack thereof, right? So you have this idea that you're only valuable if you don't have sex before marriage. And if you do, you've lost your value. And that is a message that has been communicated throughout churches for decades, and it has really, really messed with, and I would say men and women, but it was primarily focused on women, that, your value is directly tied to your sexuality, and that it's your fault if men lust, it's your fault if, they act out in a certain way. And that really pours into some negative beliefs that women have, believed or accepted or integrated into the way they view marriage. So a lot of times they will have the belief kind of as a result of this kind of teaching that, well, if I don't have enough sex with my husband, he'll look at porn, or if I don't, do this, then he'll cheat on me, or if I don't, I have to do XYZ, right? And it's so that teaching, all of that is so opposite what real intimacy and real vulnerability and real connection actually is. It actually promotes the opposite. It promotes abuse. It promotes using each other instead of a mutual giving and receiving. It really promotes viewing each other as sexual objects instead of human beings who we need to empathize and connect with. So it's very, purity culture has created a tremendous amount of damage, even if in the best scenario, it was intended for good, it has created a lot of harm. And so in both situations, you see a partner who has struggled with sexual addiction, viewing sex as bad. And then you have someone raised in purity culture that views sex as bad because they're taught, don't do it, don't do it. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. Then they're never really taught how it's good and how to actually connect with their partner and how to actually create safety and intimacy in a relationship. And so all of a sudden in their marriage day, it's supposed to be good and magical. It just doesn't work that way. And you have so many stories about that. So you have two situations here where sex historically in their subconscious has been associated with bad. And so you have tense tightness in the body, right? You have tightness in the emotions around it. Instead of having safety, instead of having freedom, instead of having joy, instead of having relaxation. And so that is where a lot of reestablishing after betrayal, when we have whatever wounds that we had before, whatever beliefs we had around sexuality before that were negative, are brought right up to the surface and highlighted. And usually it's like, see, that's true. So part of healing is going, what do I actually believe about intimacy? What do I actually believe about sexuality? What's really, truly healthy? And let me start unraveling that. Right. And so that if I'm going to do this with my partner, if I'm going to move towards something that's really healthy, if I'm going to go through the pain of reconciliation, I want something that is, beautiful and healthy and vulnerable, and where it's joyful and it's good and it's connected. And let's create that together. So the fifth reason this can be really difficult is the same reason that anything is difficult. Establishing intimacy requires commitment, time, and a willingness to face fears, be vulnerable, and go headlong into discomfort together. Often, what we as humans will choose instead is to fall back into patterns that are familiar or comfortable, because familiar feels comfortable even when it's not good for us. So I was talking earlier about how, we see this a lot. It's just a human nature thing where people will figure out a level of maintenance that is manageable for them, and they'll stay there. And that's not what we want for you. We want for both of you for this to be a lifelong thing where you continue to deepen your connection. You can continue to grow in your personal life. You continue to grow individually and as a couple. And throughout that process, your vulnerability with each other gets deeper and deeper and deeper. The more your partner can see you and you can see your partner, that continues to grow over time. Your sexual and physical and emotional and mental connection with each other starts at one level and keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper over time. I don't really think that there is a specific pinnacle that we will ever magically achieve in this world. Although I think there are many that we can achieve along the way, but I don't think there's one specific thing that we achieve and we're like, okay, we're done, and there's no more work to be done, right? I think that's part of the human experience, is this constant growth, and particularly when it's a coupleship, that it's a constant process, more communication, more vulnerability. What are my fears? What are my insecurities? What's coming up now? And every phase of life, those things shift. So this isn't like a one and done conversation. This is something that you guys keep coming towards each other. You keep turning towards each other. And whenever mistakes are made, whenever an argument is had, whenever pain happens in life, whenever something difficult happens, the tendency can be to turn away from each other and to put those walls up. The walls that feel familiar and help you feel protected. And if you want true intimacy and vulnerability in the relationship, the difficulty, but the good thing to do is going to be to turn towards each other, as painful as that may seem in the moment, and work through that together, knowing that you're on the same team, knowing that you want the same things, knowing that you have the other person's best interest at heart, and going, this is super scary, which is why it's vulnerable. Vulnerability is not fun, by the way. Vulnerability, like the reason it's vulnerable is because you're afraid. It wouldn't be vulnerability if you weren't afraid. Telling your partner, what you're scared of is scary, right? Because you don't necessarily know how they're going to respond. But the reason this is important is because the more you do it, the more they can provide safety for you and go, thank you for telling me that. And when they know what's in your head, they can then shift gears and respond appropriately to create that safety for you, and vice versa. But if we keep guessing what's in each other's heads, or we keep assuming that our partner knows how we feel, even though we've never told them, the wall is going to stay up. And the disconnect and the poor communication and the protection mechanisms and the same patterns that we've always had are just going to continue because it feels safe. It feels familiar. It feels comfortable. That's not what we want for you. It is hard, but the more you turn towards each other and do the brave thing, the more you find that it is safe. And then it does become a little easier over time. Even though there's still vulnerability every time you do it, you know that it's going to be okay if you do it. And that's what, the more you do it, the more you know that the outcome is going to be okay. So let's start with that. The first 5 reasons that it can be difficult. You've never experienced or seen what true intimacy is like. 2, the betrayed partner keeps up defenses due to the pain of the betrayal. 3, a majority of sexual experiences for the addicted partner have been associated with bad. 4, being raised in a faith and purity culture. There are confusing messages about your value being tied to your sexuality. And 5, establishing intimacy requires commitment, time, and a willingness to face fear. So it's difficult to actually create real intimacy. And it's a normal thing to want to avoid difficulty, especially after the difficulty of recovery. So I don't want to override that. The whole process is hard, and so often I'll tell partners too. I think I've even mentioned it in other episodes where I talk about the stair steps, right? You come up to another stair step and there's a place of relaxation there. And I just want to give you permission. There are so many times during recovery that it is okay to relax and say, I'm not ready for the next step. That's okay. This is a very zoomed out context here where I'm going, as long as you take the next step at some point, right? But we do have to rest. There is so much difficulty. There is so much emotional distress that we've gone through, that sometimes when we do hit a point where we have improved something in the relationship, we just want to sit with that for a while. That is okay. So I'm going to wrap up this episode with 5 benefits of true intimacy. So we talked about 5 reasons that it's difficult. I'm going to talk about 5 benefits. So number 1, you feel fully seen, loved, appreciated, and valued, right? That is what humans want, specifically from their partner. You want to feel fully seen, loved, appreciated, and valued. That's so important. That's so important. And just remembering that all of these are bi-directional. Now, that means most of the time that the betrayed partner is going to be the second person to get to this place, right? Because we have a thicker wall to come down, because the person that we are trying to see and love and appreciate and value is the one that has hurt us. So it's not usually as difficult for the person who has done the betraying to get to this place. They can usually get there faster, which is important because that's part of creating safety. That's part of creating stability. That's part of them being patient and expressing empathy long enough that we feel safe enough to take down the wall. So usually they get there first. We experience the safety and consistency long enough that we can begin taking our wall down and then begin to fully see, love, appreciate, and value them back. And then it becomes a bi-directional thing. And that's really, really, really beautiful. The second true benefit of true intimacy is that sex moves from a physical act to an intimate act, an emotionally connected experience, and even a spiritual one in some cases. This is, like I said earlier, I wish this is something that culture talked about a little bit more, and you do see it in little pockets of culture. Like if you were to sit down with someone of faith, they'd probably say, yes, it's a spiritual connection. If you were to um, sit down with certain people in different pockets of beliefs, they go, oh my gosh, it's an esoteric experience, right? But I would say as a whole, culture basically teaches that it is a need and that it is physical. And what it really is it's an opportunity for connection with someone you love and value. And so when we practice real intimacy, when we practice vulnerability, when we really connect and love and respect and send positive energy bidirectionally from two people, then it moves from a physical act to a connection act, an intimacy act. And that is a very different thing. And I want to keep coming back to that, because if that's not really something that you've thought about, I want to offer that as an opportunity for you moving forward. The third benefit of true intimacy is that you feel completely safe to be vulnerable with your partner. So something I've mentioned several times throughout this topic today, that real intimacy requires vulnerability. Like, I want you to pause and just think about, like, what is one thing? Is it a secret that you have? Is it a fear that you have, an insecurity that you have? Is it a fear about your relationship? Is it a insecurity if you say something that's true that it'll hurt your partner's feelings? Like, what is one thing that you're kind of holding back on sharing with your partner right now? I just want you to think about that. There may be an appropriate and an inappropriate way to share that. I want to say, yes, that's probably true. But if it's in your head, if it's in your heart, if it's something that you're struggling with, it should be something that you're able to communicate to your partner in a safe relationship. Because the more of those things that we have in our head and our heart that we're not talking about with our partner, even if it is a fear about the future of the relationship itself, even if it is a frustration with the way things are going, we have to be able to talk to our partner about it. That's what intimacy is. Vulnerability is doing the hard thing. It's saying the scary thing. And you can say it in a kind way. You can say it with the intention of, I want this relationship to improve. That's why I'm bringing this up. I want to talk about the difficult stuff, right? It might be valuable too to think about, how were you raised? How was your partner raised? Again, kind of going back to what we were talking about with the difficulties of all of this. Often we weren't really given examples of how to have vulnerable, scary conversations. We weren't really taught how to bring up the hard thing and to move through it and to create repair after a rupture. We were maybe demonstrated that difficult conversations happen behind closed doors, or maybe we were offered that, okay, we talk about it once and then it goes under the rug, right? And so thinking about what patterns were you raised with, we can break those, we can change those. And sometimes for a couple, it might even start with a conversation that says, hey, I would like to have more intimacy and vulnerability with you. And I see how our communication patterns kind of get in the way of that. And we only go surface level. Like, are you willing to kind of work on this with me? Like, I think it's okay when you're noticing a pattern or when you want something to change to bring it up. And it can always be brought up in a way that's helpful. Saying, hey, I want this relationship to improve. When you are on the same page, when you are moving towards the same goal, when that is clearly defined and expressed, it's going to create some safety and help you move through that. It's when you feel like you don't really know what's happening in your partner's head, you don't feel like you're on the same page, that can feel really destabilizing. The fourth benefit of true intimacy with deep safety, vulnerability, and connection comes better sex. So I think we just talked about that a little while ago. It changes, right, from physical to intimate. So when you're talking about the physical aspect of it, it's better when you have safety and vulnerability. The physicality actually improves when you have safety, vulnerability, and actual connection and intimacy. And the fifth benefit of true intimacy, you feel more confident in who you are. Integrating parts that were living in fear and moving them into being seen, loved, and accepted. I'm going to say that again. You feel the benefit of true intimacy is that you feel more confident in who you are, because you are integrating parts that were living in fear, and instead you're moving them into being seen, loved, and accepted. So those parts of you, that wall that I was talking about earlier, that defense wall, that is a part of you. And that is a part of you that is living in fear. And so when you have true intimacy and true safety, that part, instead of living in fear, it moves into being seen, loved, and accepted. And that's a huge thing of parts work is there are parts of us that show up in ways that we don't want. So that wall is an example. Anxiety is an example. Depression is an example. Defensiveness, all of these things that maybe show up in ways that we don't necessarily like, but they need to be seen, valued, loved, accepted, affirmed, because they are coming up for a reason. The wall is there because you were hurt. It served a purpose for a period of time to make sure that you saw all the red flags. The wall served a purpose to protect your vulnerable emotions from someone that truly hurt you. It served a purpose. It needs to be valued, loved, and accepted for helping you. So we don't want to fight against our parts that show up in ways that we don't like. We actually want to come around them, thank them for the service that they have provided for us, thank them for helping us, thank them for showing up and defending us in ways that maybe we couldn't defend ourselves, but then also say, hey, how can I make you feel safe so that you can go away right now, so that I can learn how to be vulnerable again? Because I want my vulnerable part to come back out. I want my intimacy part to come back out. And in order for that to happen, my protection part has to calm down a little bit. But I want to remind you, you can come back out anytime I need to be protected. So that's some of the work that you can do with your practitioner, your therapist, trauma work, that sort of thing. If you're a betrayed partner, I'm happy to kind of talk through some of the ways that maybe you might be stuck in this area. If there's some healing opportunities there for you. But I hope this has been helpful. The biggest thing I think that I would like to sort of end with is if this is difficult for you, you are definitely not alone. There are so many reasons that not just physical sex. Some people can go straight to sex and be like, it's not a problem, but really have an issue with the intimacy part. So if you are struggling with intimacy, vulnerability, safety, and connection with your partner, you are not alone. I don't even really think this is unique to people after betrayal. I think couples in general struggle with this a lot. I think intimacy and vulnerability is hard. It's difficult. It requires conscious choice to have scary conversations. And it's like, how do you do that? We're going to talk about that next week. I'm going to give you some specific questions that you and your partner can sit down and discuss together to really get inside of each other's hearts and minds and thoughts and feelings and really offer some safety and support together. I hope this episode has been helpful. We will see you next week. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.